So should you overclock your GPU, or should you undervolt your GPU? Or should you just leave it alone and not mess with it at all? Those are the questions we're going to look at today. Stay tuned. So a few weeks ago, I showed you guys how to use DLSS 4 on DLSS games by changing the DLSS version those games support. Well, kind of. I'll leave a link down in the description below if you want to check that video out. But at the end of every video, I like to try to find a past video that I've done that kind of relates to the subject matter of the current video, to give you guys something else related to watch. In that video, I showed you guys an older video on overclocking a GPU, but I realized that it's been a really long time since I've done a video on overclocking GPUs. Also, I couldn't decide if I wanted to recommend undervolting or overclocking, and that made me realize that I don't think I've ever done a video comparing the two together. So here we are. Today, I'm going to show you how to do both. We'll talk about the pros and cons for each, but first, I got to pay some bills. So check out today's sponsor. Are you still running Windows 11 unactivated because the license just costs too much? Then you should check out today's sponsor, VIP-SCDKey, where you can get a valid Windows 11 license for around $20. Stop dealing with that stupid watermark and actually be able to change your desktop background with a valid license for Windows 11. Just go to the link in the description below and pick up a valid Windows 11 license key. During checkout, use the code CyberCPU for a 25% discount. Once you have your key, go to your activation settings in Windows 11 and click the link that says Change Product Key. Enter the product key you just purchased and hit Activate. Now you don't have to deal with that stupid watermark. And check out the description for deals on not just Windows, but Office too. Now, on with the video. So, regardless of whether or not you're undervolting or overclocking, I typically like to overclock the memory first because the memory on a GPU can sometimes be a little bit finicky and hard to get stable. So if you do this first and just get it out of the way, you can then use the same settings for your overclock or your underclock. Also, by dealing with the memory first and getting that stable, that's one less thing to worry about later on when you're trying to troubleshoot issues with your overclock. So let's jump on the system real quick and find a stable memory overclock. Okay, so here we are in Windows 11, and like I said, the first thing that we're going to do is overclock the memory and get that stable, and then we'll play around with what we're going to do with the core later, like whether we're going to undervolt it or overclock it. So to do that, we're going to need a couple of programs. The first one is MSI Afterburner. So go ahead and launch this app real quick. And I'll go ahead and leave a link to this app down in the description below. Now, I already have this one set up, but let me go ahead and show you some of the settings that I like to change on it. So if you go into settings, the first two that you want to check is the unlock voltage control and the unlock voltage monitoring. Now, you may have to change this right here. I usually leave it at reference design, and that typically works. This is an EVGA GPU, so that seems to work well with EVGA. However, you might have to change this voltage control to a different one depending on what GPU you have. However, for mine, I'm going to leave it on reference design. And then at that point, you can go ahead and hit OK. And then you'll have to restart MSI Afterburner once you do that in order to have the changes that you just did take effect. And then the next thing you want to launch is whenever I'm overclocking the memory, I like to use Furmark just because it's a very consistent, repeatable benchmark that will run the GPU up to 100%. And also make sure to max out the anti-aliasing on it because you want to essentially take up as much memory as possible. And by maxing out the anti-aliasing, it will max out the memory use as well, especially on a 3070 that only has 8 gigs of memory. And then the next thing that I would do is in MSI Afterburner, essentially turn up the core voltage, the power limit, and the temp limit before we start actually overclocking. Now the core voltage might be a little bit scary, but all this is doing is it's raising the core voltage by 100 millivolts. And the card isn't going to harm itself, so it's only going to use whatever core voltage it needs. You're just raising that up by 100 millivolts that will be available to it. It doesn't actually raise the core voltage 100 millivolts all the time. It's still managed by the GPU. You're just giving it a little bit more that it can use if it wants it. And go ahead and hit the check mark to apply it. And at that point, we can go ahead and start the stress test and go ahead and hit OK right here. And once this starts, essentially what we're going to be looking for is you just want to kind of look at this repeating pattern that goes over and over again. And as you can see right now, we are running 100% CPU usage and 100% of the frame buffer, which is what we want for overclocking the memory. So to do this, all we're gonna do is we're essentially going to start turning the memory up until we start seeing weird artifacts show up on the screen. Now, typically on this card right here, I know that we can go 1000 megahertz right off the bat. So if we go to 1000 and hit OK, and then just kind of watch it for a minute and see what it does. I don't know if you can hear this on the mic, but the fan speed is definitely ramping up on this thing. And essentially what you're going to do is once you see that there are no artifacts show up on the screen, you're going to want to just continue to increase this memory clock. So I'm going to go to 1100 now, hit enter and hit apply, and then just keep an eye open. Now, as you're going, the temperature is going to rise on the GPU as this benchmark continues to go. So sometimes a memory clock that seems to work at the beginning won't necessarily work later on once the GPU gets a little bit hotter. So you might want to play around with it a little bit. The whole point of this right now is to make sure that this is stable. So once you find a memory clock that you think is stable, then I would walk away and just let it run for a while and let it really burn in and let the GPU heat up on that memory clock. So it looks like 1100 is working out. So we're going to go to 1200 real quick. We're going to hit apply, and then and as you can see right here, all of a sudden we got an artifact that showed up on the screen. Now, the further you go, the more artifacts that you're going to see. So at this point, what I would do is go ahead and close FurMark. We're going to go ahead and lower this down back to 1100 where we had it before, apply it, and then we're going to launch FurMark again. And then essentially do the same thing. Now, what you're going to want to do is just let this run. And like I said, let it run, let the GPU heat up, and look for any kind of different artifacts showing up on the screen. Now, you will eventually see some artifacts, like on this one, I know that at 1100, artifacts will eventually start to show up. So the way that this one runs stable is right at 1000, is from what I've found in my testing prior to making this video. So I'm gonna go ahead and lower it down to 1000 right now. And then at 1000, I would still just walk away and make sure it stays stable. Now, once you find a stable clock speed for your memory, typically what I would do is drop it down just a little bit more from there, just to kind of make it as stable as possible. So for what I've set on this GPU is 900, and I found 900 to be a really good overclock for this GPU. So now that we have our memory stable, we can move on to overclocking the core. Overclocking a GPU essentially is taking the factory clock speed that the GPU runs at and simply turning it up. So let's jump back on the system real quick and see how far we can push this 3070. Okay, so this thing's been running for a while and it doesn't show any artifacts, so our memory clock should be good at this point. So I'm gonna go ahead and close FurMark. And then at this point, since we have a stable memory overclock, I'm gonna go ahead and save that in slot 5 right here. And that'll kind of give us a starting point for us to start our overclock and our undervolt, because we're gonna separate those two to see which one's better. And to do the core overclock itself, what I typically like to use is the program Heaven right here. And Heaven, I think, will do better than FurMark, but I think you can still do the same thing with FurMark. I just like to do it with Heaven because Heaven kind of jumps from different sections, so it's not really a consistent pattern going over and over again. It kind of stresses the GPU in different ways depending on where in the benchmark that we are located at. So the first thing that you want to do is just start raising the core clock. So for this one right here, I'm going to raise it by 50 megahertz. We're going to apply it and then just look at the screen and see what starts to happen and see if you can see any artifacts. Definitely, if the program itself locks up and crashes, then you've went too high. So if 50 does good, then go buy another 50. So we're going to go ahead and add 50 more and hit apply and then just see how it runs. Now at this point right here, our temperature is going to continue to go up as we raise the core clock. And because the temperature goes up, as the temperature gets higher, the system will get less stable. So once we find a core clock that seems to work, we're going to want to do the same thing. We're going to want to run it for a long period of time and let that temperature get to a point to where it equalizes, where it's not getting hotter anymore, where essentially the cooling system catches up with the overclock that we have right now. So at our 50 right here, we're going to go up to 100. We're going to apply it again, and we're going to see how it runs. And we're going to keep jumping this up by 50 megahertz each time until we have some kind of a major problem. So we're going to go from 100 to 150, hit enter and apply this one, and then just keep an eye out on the screen until something happens. Now, as of right now, it seems like it's running pretty good. But like I said, we're gonna have to continue to run it for a long period of time to see if this overclock actually does work. And you can kind of, if you keep an eye out real close, some of the things that you'll see once things get unstable is different artifacts in the screen. And this kind of becomes more of a subjective thing that you have to play with. But since 150 seems like it's working okay, we're gonna go ahead and jump it to 200 and then apply it. And as you can see, as soon as we applied it, the screen stopped. In fact, the entire screen went black. So as you can see, it did crash. So we're gonna go ahead and lower it back down to 150, apply it, and we're gonna go ahead and start Heaven again. Now, this is essentially what it's gonna take in order to get your overclock stable. Now, we know we can't go to 200 megahertz. 150 was the last stable megahertz that we went to. Now, at this point, what you have to do is just let it run and see what the highest point or the highest overclock that you can get is. Now, since I've already gone through and tested this for quite a while, I know that 150 won't work either. 150 will crash as well. 130 is actually the point where this GPU stays stable. Anything over 130 and it starts to crash again. So overclocking the core isn't as straightforward as overclocking memory. That's why I had you overclock memory first. This is essentially going to be a game of kind of cat and mouse where you're going to be chasing down crashes until you get the system to run stable. Because ultimately, running Heaven or Furmark might end up being stable at higher overclocks, but then you have the system crash as soon as you launch a game that you want to play. So let's look at some benchmarks and see how much better over stock it performed with the core overclock. The first game we're looking at is Counter-Strike 2. With the GPU stock, we got an average FPS of 217.1 and a 1% low of 83.2. Now, with the overclock, we got an average FPS of 229.2 and a 1% low of 90.1. That's a 5.4% better average FPS and 8% better frame timings. However, in order to achieve that, we increased our temperature and wattage. With the 3070 stock, we hit a max core temperature of 70.4 with an 82.2 Celsius hotspot. We also consumed a max wattage of 246.5 watts. With the overclock, we hit a max core temperature of 74.5 with an 86.2 Celsius hotspot. That's a 5.7% higher core temperature and a 4.8% higher hotspot temperature, while consuming 8.5% more power. Considering that the overclock consumed a max wattage of 268.5 watts. So we definitely got a good performance boost, but it cost us quite a bit in temperature and power consumption. Switching over to Cyberpunk, the story is not too much different. On stock settings, we got an average FPS of 60.4 and a 1% low of 50.8. Once overclocking the GPU, we got an average FPS of 65.5 and a 1% low of 54.6. Here we were able to get an 8.1% better frame rate and 7.2% better frame timings. However, just like before, it cost us because on stock settings, we hit a maximum core temp of 71.3 with an 83.6 Celsius hotspot. We also consumed 242.9 watts. With the overclock, we hit a maximum core temp of 76.5 with an 89 Celsius hotspot. We also consumed a maximum of 269 watts. That's a 7% higher core temperature and a 6.3% higher hotspot with 10.2% higher power consumption. So again, we gained a lot of performance, but it cost us temperature and power usage. So in every game, we did get a pretty good boost in performance. However, in every game, we also got a boost in temperature as well as power consumption, which ultimately leads to higher temperatures. Now, undervolting is kind of a completely different premise than overclocking because you're likely never going to get as much performance out of undervolting than you will overclocking, but you could potentially have a more stable experience during gameplay. The reason for this is by dropping the voltage, you're actually dropping the amount of power that the GPU uses. And in turn, the amount of heat it produces as well. This can lead to a more consistent clock speed and ultimately more consistent gameplay. So let's jump back in the system and I'll show you how to undervolt it. Okay, so what we can do, we can go ahead and shut Heaven down here real quick. And now we're gonna set this up so we can actually do undervolting. So I'm just gonna pull this up just a little bit just to give myself a little bit of room. And then before we make any changes here, I wanna go ahead and save this to spot 1 so we can go back to our overclock later if we want to. But for this one right here, essentially what we're gonna wanna do is you can reset it if you want. However, there's not a lot of things we need to change. I'm just gonna turn our core voltage down, and I'm gonna change this back to 0 here and open up the curve editor. Now in the curve editor, there's a couple of changes that you want to make before we get into actually undervolting itself. However, let me explain how the curve editor works. Essentially, all these little dots right here are just different points in the GPU's boost algorithm that correspond with the amount of voltage to the amount of frequency that the core is running at. So right now you're looking at 912 millivolts, and at 912 millivolts, it's typically running at 1785 megahertz. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and run at the lower voltage, but we want to go higher in the boost frequency for that voltage. And that's why it's called undervolting, because you're overclocking the GPU core while keeping the core voltage down at a lower setting. So the first thing we're going to want to do before we start playing around with these settings too much is kind of set up the curve editor for what we want to do. Because what I've found is that in a lot of times what'll happen is your GPU will become stable at the higher speeds. However, it will get less stable at the lower speeds. So I like to lift the core voltage up at the lower speeds a little bit before we start changing this. And to do that, go ahead and click on the very, very last setting right here. Hold the shift key down and then drag this down a little bit. And usually you can drag it down by like probably about 300 megahertz here. And then we go over here, we click on the very first core voltage, and then we hit the control key and then drag this up and overlap the original line. You can see this original line right here of where the original curve editor was at, and I raise it up to about 70, 80 megahertz. That's fine right there. And then once we get that, we're going to want to find a point in this curve that we're going to change to what's going to be our normal maximum core voltage. So we're going to start out with, let's go to about 912 megahertz, right about here. And then I'm going to raise this up to roughly about, let's bring it up to about 2010. So that you just grab it and drag this over. And if you want to, you can use the arrows to dial it in really well. And then once you get it to the point to where you like it, so I have it right now at 912 millivolts at 2010 megahertz, go ahead and just hit apply. And then by hitting apply, it will straighten that line out right there. Now we do need to take a look right here and make sure. And as you can see, it dropped it down to 1995. It's not where we wanted it. So the curve editor does have a tendency to sometimes be finicky. So you might have to change your settings multiple times to get it to where you actually want it. And now we have it right where we want it. So now that we have it applied, we're going to go ahead and start this real quick and see how it runs at those settings. And there we go. We can go ahead and watch our MSI afterburner as the temperature goes up. You can see that we're stuck now at 912 millivolts. Now we want to take a really close look right here and make sure that we don't have any kind of artifacting and especially crashing. And sometimes that can be kind of monotonous and it takes quite a bit of time to come to. However, at some point, eventually we're going to find that it's going to crash. And when it does crash, the way you fix that is essentially just by changing which voltages you decide to go to in order for that to happen. So I know at some point this is, and it just did crash. So as it froze up right here, you can see that obviously this setting doesn't work. So it's going to take a second for us to come back. There it goes. Okay. So as we can see, that did not work. So in order to fix it back, go ahead and push. If you saved your last setting at number 5, go ahead and hit number 5 and go back to the setting you were before. You can lower the core voltage right here too. And our curve editor should be the same as it was before. So what we're going to do is we're just going to click on the first one, do exactly the same thing. Hold down shift, pull it down about 300 megahertz or so. Click on the first one, hit the control key and bring it up right about, between 70 to 80 megahertz higher than it was before. And then go down and find the actual voltage that you were on before. Now before we were on 912 millivolts and 912 obviously didn't work. And essentially what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to keep raising up your millivolts until you find one that has the system stay stable. Now I've done this already. So the one I found to be the most stable is if you go up to 925 and then bring 925 up to 1980. And then we're going to scroll down right here until we hit 1980. And then just like before, we're going to go ahead and hit apply. We're going to let that line go. And as you can see, it changed to 1995, which would not be stable. So we're going to have to set it back to 1980. And this is one of the things I found with undervolting that is a little bit annoying. You have to keep changing your settings over and over again until you get to a point to where they will change to what you wanted them to change to in the first place. So it is really finicky changing the undervolt settings in MSI Afterburner, but it is what it is. It's the tools that we have to do it, so we have to kind of take what we have. But at this point, it should stay stable at 1980 megahertz at 925 millivolts. And as you can see in MSI Afterburner, that's exactly what it's doing, is it's running at 1980 at 925 millivolts. And as you can see, it's running considerably cooler than it was before, because before we were sitting at probably the mid 70s, and now we're in the mid 60s. So we lost about 10 Celsius, which is pretty good. So now that we have a stable undervolt, let's go ahead and go through some of the benchmarks again and see what this one did for us. So the first game we're looking at again is Counter-Strike 2. So I'll go ahead and put the stock settings on the screen because there's no point in going over those again. With the undervolt, we got an average FPS of 225 with a 1% low of 89.2. This gives us a 3.6% better frame rate and 7% better frame timings. We did this with a maximum core temp of 68.3 and an 80.7 Celsius hotspot. And we consumed 249.1 watts. Now, as you can see here, we actually lost 3% of our maximum core temp, and we lost 1.6% of our hotspot. However, we gained 1% to our power usage. However, the 249.1 was the maximum wattage that spiked right as the game launched. We actually averaged about 185 watts throughout gameplay, with the stock settings averaging about 227 watts. This gives us a 20.4% drop in average power consumption. The next game we're looking at is Cyberpunk. Just like before, I'll put the stock settings on the screen so we don't have to go over them again. With the undervolt, we got a 64.3 FPS average frame rate and a 1% low of 54. That's a 6.3% better frame rate and 6.1% better frame timings. We did all this with a maximum core temperature of 70.3 with an 83 Celsius hotspot. That's a 1.4% lower core temperature and a 0.7% lower hotspot. We also consumed a maximum of 232.9 watts. That gave us a 4.2% drop in power usage. So as you can see, both with the overclock and the undervolt, we gained performance. We gained quite a bit of performance actually with the overclock, but not quite as much with the undervolt. However, that's kind of what I said at the beginning. Either way though, with the undervolt, we did gain through our lower temperatures and our lower power usage. So which one of these you go with kind of really depends on what you want to achieve. If you want the absolute highest performance that your GPU is capable of producing, then I would go with the overclock. Clearly, it had the best numbers. However, if you're looking for a boost in performance while not sacrificing stability, then the undervolt was a great choice. Not only did we get excellent temperatures and power usage, but we did get a pretty consistent frame timings as well. The problem here is you're going to work harder for the undervolt. And honestly, it takes a considerable amount of tweaking, at least more than the overclock does. Also, one of the downsides with the undervolt is that MSI Afterburner just isn't very consistent. When you save your undervolt settings and then reapply them later, I've had the maximum boost clock lower, giving me less performance, or even going up, causing games to crash. This means that I have to spend some of the time that I want to spend playing games tinkering with my undervolt in order to get it consistent, even after setting it up and spending the time to set it up, because MSI Afterburner just doesn't save the settings that I want it to reapply. Ultimately though, if you want the most reliable experience possible, then there's nothing wrong with just leaving your card stock and using it the way that it comes. Honestly, that's what I do most of the time. Or if you want to get even more extreme, you can always water cool your GPU. And if you'd like to know more about that, then check out this video here where I water cool a 3060. Something I plan to do with this 3070 here if my water block would ever arrive. But as always, you guys have a great day.